Hey everyone, and welcome to RPG Horror Stories with D&D Doge. In today's video, we have a tale about a Dungeons & Dragons player that wants to play a character based off The Last Airbender that goes a bit too far. A story about a dude that takes drastic measures to make sure his game isn't interrupted, and much more. But before we get into the stories, here is Nipsey to help farm some likes for the video.
Nipsey.
Thanks, bud. Now, let's get into these stories. Disgusting Sokka ripoff gets forcibly removed from the table. By Reddit user, Throwaway DnD. I used to play Dungeons & Dragons at a game shop with a mix of friends and acquaintances. The Dungeon Master was an acquaintance, but seemed like a cool dude. Then there was another new guy, Problem Player, aka Sokka, and my two friends, both female, one of which would play a Moon Elf Cleric and the other a Drow Sorcerer. The fact that my friend chose a Moon Elf Cleric was probably the impetus for the new guy to play as, quote, Sokka, a Ranger Fighter, given that his girlfriend in the show, Avatar The Last Airbender if it wasn't obvious, turned into the moon. He said he was going to play Sokka but more based. He was one of the worst players I have ever dealt with. He, the player, had serious main character syndrome, and this was poorly masked by his character's obvious arrogance. He was very quick to murder NPCs, usually for no good reason other than the NPC pushed back against his BS. He would also always claim to be the leader of the group and get super aggressive with anyone, especially women, who challenged his authority as a man and a leader. This usually meant that whenever a female NPC came around, he would either be extremely confrontational with her or hit on her in the most cringe way possible. Like, I remember when we encountered the female peasant rebel leader of a liberated town. He could not stop mocking the idea of a woman leader. He asked her quote, body count, and demanded that she get on her knees and suck his cock. And this is when you stop the game and tell the player to cut the crap. And when she refused, he began attacking her with his sword. He defeated her and made sure to take her down non-lethally, so the Dungeon Master decided that she was a fey spirit and had her body turn into spiritual energy and float away. He later admitted to me that he wasn't originally planning for her to be a fey spirit, but feared what kind of sick things he would have done to her. Or you pull the player aside and tell him to cut it out or he's gone. Look, I'm fine with in-game sexism, but this guy's playstyle was straight up immersion breaking and made it hard for the actual female players to play since his sexism was spilling out of game. This became increasingly apparent when we found his Instagram account, and oh boy, this guy didn't just take the red pill, he swallowed the whole bottle. The party unanimously decided not to kick him though, because we all thought he was pretty young, just graduated from high school, and would grow out of it as he actually interacted with real women. I remember Moon Elf jokingly said, "Every campaign needs at least one a-hole." But this is where things take an effed up turn. You see, quote-unquote Sokka was flirting with Moon Elf this whole campaign, and we were all fine with this, even as his flirtation got more desperate. Moon Elf eventually told him that she could never be with him because he is just projecting his feelings for his old girlfriend onto her, and that her connection to the moon would not bring her back. In my opinion, this could have been a great character moment to plant the seeds of character development for this douchier version of Sokka. But that's not how it went down. Fast forward to an encounter with some ogres, and Moon Elf is knocked out. During the battle, quote-unquote Sokka rescues her by taking her to a nearby cave, and then out of nowhere says that he, quote, makes love to her as if he is making love to the moon. The Dungeon Master says, "You know she is still knocked out, right?" And he just said, "I know." Moon Elf told him to cut it out, that she doesn't want to sleep with him, and the Dungeon Master said, "No raping player characters. It's literally the only rule for this campaign, and you already know this." And then, he said the most disgusting thing I have ever heard him say. He said, "It's not rape if she likes it, and I roll a performance check to see if she does." And then, the DM just shook his head and said, "Okay, Sokka, before you roll, Zuko appears out of the shadows of the cave, casts Firebolt on you, which burns you to a crisp and you die. He then creeps back into the shadows and spontaneously disappears." And then the DM told him to leave the table and that he was sick of his BS. He tried to argue and say, "It's what Sokka would do," and "no girl could resist Sokka's dick." But the DM just kept telling him to leave the table more firmly. He then got more and more belligerent with both the Dungeon Master and Moon Elf, until the Dungeon Master threatened to tell the beefy de facto security guy working there that this player is refusing to leave the table after trying to make his character SA another character in-game. He would not stop though, and was increasingly yelling at Moon Elf for not giving him a chance in-game. Dungeon Master then motioned for the beefy dude to come over and told him what happened, and the incel just tried to lie and say that the Dungeon Master and the other players tried to rape his character. We all corroborated DM's story, and beefy dude kicked Sokka out of the store. He refused to go, so he had to manhandle him out as he screamed a bunch of insults at the DM, the party, and Moon Elf. We just then carried on as if he died before he could even think to do what he was gonna do, and Moon Elf lived, as Dungeon Master just wanted to not let that be her last memory as her character. So he obviously got banned from the game shop. He also blocked us on literally everything, which is fine by me. He just beat me to it. So yeah, if you're reading this quote-unquote Sokka, thank you for ruining a great character. You suck on multiple levels. TLDR, an incel plays as a bastardized version of Sokka and tried to rape an unconscious character and justify it in real life. Dungeon Master kicked him, and he had to be manhandled out of the store because he wouldn't leave. Well, at least this one had a happy ending. I personally never watched The Last Airbender, so I have no form of reference about that character, but I imagine that the show's character wouldn't have been this much of an edgelord. Hell, the moment that he told the Dungeon Master that his character would be like Sokka but more based should have been a warning sign in and of itself. Hell, just the first instance of the player wanting to do non-lethal damage to the one female character and wanted to roleplay SA should have been the point that he was kicked, or got a warning at least. Though hindsight is 20/20, and at least they eventually kicked the dude and continued having fun with the game. Let's move on. The host that wants to play in peace, so he commits a crime. Submitted to the D&D Doge subreddit by Reddit user Galdragar. Hello everybody. Long-time viewer, first-time poster here. I am not a native English speaker, so I'm sorry if I make any grammatical mistakes or misspell some words. Anyway, this story involves a group I played some games with, all full of horror stories. So if this one works out, I'll keep posting more stories. I have always been the forever DM in my group. My closest friends started playing Dungeons & Dragons when I decided to start DMing. We had a full year of one-shots that were quite fun. It was my first time as a Dungeon Master, so I took it easy. At one point, one of my friends, let's call him Ariel, the typical player who takes games and roleplay very seriously, told me that one of his childhood friends was going to start running some D&D games, and that they needed one more player. So, excited to be able to be a player again, I accepted. The first few games were pretty good, though somewhat loaded with SA jokes, and with players who tried so hard to be murder hobos. More on that in the following stories. But it was nothing I couldn't handle. We usually played at the DM's house. Let's call him Esteban. He was a few years older than the rest of us, and had an outside room that he had dedicated entirely to D&D. I knew he had a wife and a daughter, but I never got to meet them. Whenever we played, his wife stayed home with the child, and we never saw each other. His games were fun, and he had a lot of minis and assets to play with that made everything a more immersive experience. Except for his dog. A rather hyperactive doggo Argentino that, whenever we sat down to play, would nibble on our feet or try to get on the table. And you wouldn't even think of throwing the minis or dice on the floor, because they would disappear without a doubt. One night, a couple of weeks after Christmas, we got together to make a thematic game. This time, the Dungeon Master was going to be me again. We knew from the beginning that his wife would not be there, and that he would have to take care of his little girl. So it was going to be a lighter game, to just hang out, drink some beer, and roll some dice. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was that the dog didn't come out to greet us with his exaggerated amount of energy, but I assumed that, since it was raining, he didn't want to get his paws wet. After about 2 hours of play, I thought it was very strange that his dog had slept all night, and I also thought about the little girl, who, in spite of being alone in the house, had not cried or made a single noise. When I asked Esteban about these issues, he said what I never thought would come out of a family man's mouth. He had given the dog drugs to sedate him, and had put whiskey in the 2-year-old's bottle to make her sleep so he could play undisturbed. Everyone at the table disapproved of that. After all, he was committing a crime, but we finished the game anyway, as there was very little left. Needless to say, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I never played at his house again, and tried to keep him out of my tables with excuses. Anyway, that was the most horrible story in this group, but not the only one. I'll keep posting if it works out. Greetings to all. Well, that is definitely a WTF. Now, I have heard of dog treats that have CBD in them in order to calm dogs down, but the giving whiskey to a 2-year-old to knock them out for the night is a bit much. Honestly, if the wife wasn't going to be there in order to watch their kid, then they could have just not played that night. Or, like OP said, distractions wouldn't be an issue since they prepped a lighter game. Definitely some questionable parenting skills from this dude. Let's move on. Dungeon Master forced my character to sleep with his character. Requested ERP after session. By Reddit user, Masked Cats. I've very much been on the D&D grind lately, and only recently came across this sub, so I thought I'd share the only real horror story that has been stuck in the back of my head the past 4 years I've played D&D. The party was adventuring through a spooky forest during nightfall, and one of the party members was quite exhausted of their resources, so we managed to find a small inn on the outskirts to rest at. The place felt quite homely, until we met a pair of traveling merchants who were shapeshifter siblings. The Dungeon Master was quick to reveal that these were his characters that he had played as before. One of them began flirting with my character, but I made it clear that I wasn't interested before he turned to trying to magically charm me. Thankfully, I saved, and then put my foot down, but the rest of the party didn't read the room and insisted that we finished resting there. The Dungeon Master's character then tried to spice up the night for the rest of the party by challenging our barbarian to a duel. If the barbarian won, we would get supplies for the day ahead of us, and if he lost, then he'd have to take something from us instead. I spent most of the fight watching, discreetly casting spells to aid the barbarian before he won the fight, but the Dungeon Master's character would notice my tampering and rule that he won by default, before picking my character up and taking him to his room, with the session ending then and there. After everyone started to leave, the Dungeon Master stopped me and asked me to stay to, quote, play out the rest of the session in private. I declined and immediately left, but he would keep trying to pry via text later that night, asking what my character would do. I asked if I could slit his character's throat in his sleep, but he of course declined, but told me that I'd wake to his character gone, leaving behind a note asking to, quote, "have fun again some other time." I pretty much cut contact with the group after that, though years later, I noticed that he occasionally likes some of the art that I post on social media, and it reminds me of this story from time to time. Yeah, I would say that Dungeon Master was a major creeper. Trying to force someone to stay back for a one-on-one ERP after everyone left really gave off major Predator vibes. Good on OP for just noping out of there, and I don't blame her for not going back to that game. No D&D is better than Predator D&D. On to the next one. Why did they even come to the con? By Reddit user AT Lander. The year 2009. The game D&D 3.5. The event my college's little RPG con. The naive child, me, 19-year-old female. I was running a one-shot of my own at the con, so I only had time for one other game. The sign-in board was packed, and I decided to pick the only DM I'd never played with before. Big mistake. I walked into the room, high on the adrenaline of running a fun session, and everyone else, in their 30s to 40s, were chatting like they all knew each other. I thought nothing of it, until the DM started handing out character sheets. Or rather, a sheet. A sheet that had the most bare-bones human fighter I've ever seen. Inventory? Just armor and a masterwork longsword. The rest of the party pulled out their sheets, with detailed characters with complex backstories, and tons of magic items, all apparently from their home game. The one I remember was a Minotaur cleric lady, but they were all similarly extra, and 2 levels higher than me. The adventure started with a giant hole opening up under us. Naturally, we had to break our fall, and while everyone else had magic, all I had was a sword, so I stuck it into the dirt wall of the pit to slow me down. The dungeon master looked confused, but said that it worked. We landed in a dungeon full of traps and puzzles. Apparently, it was all made by the BBEG of their home game, and the whole thing sounded very interesting, but nobody bothered to explain because there was a lot of dungeon and a limited time slot. Again, all I had was a sword, so I used it in every clever way I could think of. I poked things to test for illusions, used it as a lever, etc., when the other player characters weren't talking over me. I solved a few puzzles that way, until... DM, your sword breaks. Me, what? Why? DM, it's a non-magical sword, and it's made for fighting. You keep using it for other things, and that damages the metal. I saw his point, and being non-confrontational, I just shut up. It felt like my fault for being so cavalier with the only tool I had. But what else was I supposed to do? I had no other items, and we hadn't fought a single enemy. Then we finally got out of the dungeon, and there he was, the BBEG. He laughed, monologued about some interesting plot that went way over my head, and summoned a rain of rats that the magic users blocked, so we wound up surrounded by dead rats. It was hilarious. Of course, I went into the fight without a weapon, so I just punched some of the surviving rats for 1d3 damage, and they got an opportunity attack every time I attacked. They had to wrap up the fight quickly because the con ended at midnight. Everyone was complaining as they packed up, asking why couldn't they use the room for longer? Why did they only get one new party member? Why did they all have to waste money paying for this when they could have just played at home? I honestly don't know, and I definitely don't know why I asked if I could join their home game. Thank RNGesus they said no. Well, that seemed kinda dumb. Why take your home game to a tabletop RPG convention? Why give OP nothing but a sword and armor? I mean, every character should start with some other stuff. Maybe the group spread out over the course of the convention to play some one-shots, and decided to have a session of their home game near the end, and just didn't expect anyone to sign up for it. I don't know. This one is just confusing. But that is all I have for you today. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may your games remain horror story free. Until next time.